and welcome everyone to Tama Talks. Today we will be joined by artist and TAM director Max Presneill to discuss the work of UK-based artist Fiona Rae. I'm Janine Madden, the Torrance Art Museum Advocates or Tama president, and this talk is being recorded and can be found on the Tama YouTube channel. If you've missed our other talks or want to share them or watch them again, this is where you can find them, as well as on our website. So just as a reminder, feel free to keep your video on if you'd like. The way that I'm sharing the screen lets me, hold on, I think someone's trying to get in. There we go. The way that I'm sharing the screen lets me omit the people who are watching, and you'll just see what's on the screen. And there is a Zoom feature where you can use your spacebar to temporarily unmute yourself. So if you are muted and you want to contribute, feel free to just hit your spacebar and you should be able to participate. You can also raise your hand in the Zoom reactions function as well. And feel free to put any questions or anything that you have in the chat, and Max and I will kind of keep an eye on that. So today's Tama talk is going to be a little bit different structurally from what we've done previously. Max went through and selected a lot of work from Fiona Rae's portfolio, if you will, history of work. And we're going to go through an overview of some of her work. And then we're going to, toward the end, spend a little more time on a few highlighted works at the end. And as with all of the sessions, feel free to break in with any questions or comments. I will, if you'd like me to include, if there's a work that you'd like me to include a link to, I'm happy to do that in the chat. I'm going to open that chat right now so I can just put stuff in there for you. Okay. So a little bit about Fiona Rae. She is a contemporary British painter known for her work involving abstract forms, bright colors, and psychedelic designs. Born on October 10th, 1963 in Hong Kong, she went on to study at Goldsmiths College. In 1988, she participated in Frieze, an art exhibition organized by Damien Hirst in London Docklands. The exhibition helped launch a generation of artists who became known as the YBAs, or Young British Artists. She often deploys fonts, icons, and graphics in her work, engaging in the larger movements of painterly abstraction. And this distinctive mixture of popular imagery with the dialogue of abstraction is a mode that has helped her that she has helped to pioneer, and she's gone on to influence a significantly large generation of younger painters. Her works are held in the permanent collections of the Torrance Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C., the Tate Gallery in London, and the Museum of Modern Art in Oslo. She was elected to the Royal Academy of Arts in 2002 and is referred to as a Royal Academician, allowing the use of RA after her name. In 2002, she was appointed as a Tate Artist Trustee, and she was commissioned by the Tate Modern to create a 10-meter triptych Shadowland for the restaurant there. In 2011, she was appointed Professor of Painting at the Royal Academy, one of the first two female professors since the Academy was founded in 1768. She lives and works in London, England. And I put her website on this page, and I'm happy to put it in the chat if anyone's interested. Unlike some of the other talks, predominantly all of the images and language that we've used in today's presentation are taken directly from her website. And so let's take a look at the first couple of images.
You want me to start on some thoughts?
Please.
Okay, so let's ground this first of all, which is I'm going to be talking about this as a fanboy and as somebody who's been tremendously influenced by Fiona Rae's work. And I want to make it clear that I don't know how much Fiona Rae herself would agree with my thoughts. And you have to recognize that this is my interpretation. This is the way that I'm thinking about these things. I did write something, very short thing about her work. It was on the TAM website, and she emailed me
Oh,
in response, and I was totally a fanboy. I had to stop myself from going, "Oh my God!"
well, that's good. I have a link to it. It's down at the bottom in some of the other slides, but I'll lift it and throw it in the chat when we get to it. But yes, we saw that you had used her work as a staff pick, and so really happy that you're able to. It's really cool, I think, that you're able to offer your thoughts about her work today.
Just yeah, I don't get fanboyish with movie stars or anybody else, but I did a bit when I got the email. Anyway, so one of the things, there's a couple of things I want to point out. First of all, is that I already had a little bit of a distrust of abstraction in my earlier painting days, and when I first saw her work, I liked the way that it presented it as a set of propositions, a set of painterly propositions, which are exploring what mark making might be. And each of these, by being isolated, it gives it full reign to be able to say, look at this. It's more complicated than a scribble. But what it does is it talks about that mark making very directly. This one is somehow different from this one. And looking at the language of painting used allows us to ask, and in which ways. So, and if we can look at the differentials, then we can start really exploring what meanings might be imbued into mark making. And I think that what that did for me personally is it really opened up the idea of abstraction being a possibility to explore some ideas through the materiality of the paint, as opposed to something which was a intuitive, emotion-based kind of exploration, which I didn't feel very comfortable with. So I think the first thing with this is looking at these is to recognize that this is a kind of philosophical way, or a more conceptual way, of starting to talk about those elements of the personal, the spontaneous, the emotion, all this kind of ways of thinking about painting, but talking about it through the lens of a more critical eye. And I think this is an important thing. Now, as you can see, there's lots of different applications of paint, and this in itself against a plain background. I think what's important is recognizing that the plain background allows the picture plane to become an arena of activity, rather than something that's talking about necessarily talking about, say, spatial depth. It isn't. It's talking about what sits on the surface. And because there's a plain background, all of these things are, by that background, united as a set of ideas or thoughts that we're bringing together on that plane. Can we go to the next one?
Yes.
I'm running through. So you see now, as time goes on, a couple of years later, they start getting more sophisticated in the types of mark making that she uses. You can see that the colors are starting to explode out. That there really is everything from drips and stains and washes to impasto paint. But what I think is important in the painting she did of this era is that the elements that are coming in are no longer just brushstrokes, but they start referencing things in the world. They are abstractions from objects in the world, coupled with moments and passages which are to do with the history of painting. And so they're partly about the history of that abstraction through the lineage, if you like, of abstract expressionism in particular. They also have and again, I don't know if Ray would even agree with this, but I would suggest that there is a kind of certain punk rock approach to this kind of deliberately messing and not doing the beautiful passage in these that is quite in your face. But it also ties in at that time with ideas that were common not only amongst arguments about postmodernism, but were arguments culturally about what sampling in hip hop was about. And these bringing together all these elements, quotations from the past, if you like, that, sampling a song, etc. And also, again, both punk and hip hop were in their early days were very DIY. And I really like this idea that this is all about DIY appropriating, bringing things into the same arena, and then allowing them to be on one side both autonomous in their existence, if you like, but at the same time, because of the united background of the picture plane, as being in a networked relationship to each other, so that meaning is changed and fluid depending on how you go through the process of aligning aspects on the picture plane with other aspects on the picture plane. Now, this for me is still the way I think about painting, but it's also been influential because it's the way I think about curation. I think about curation as a lot of autonomous things coming together in a room, which changes what meanings are generated in that interaction in the space or the picture plane. And it kind of really questions how knowledge is formed. How does one understand the world? What do we bring to understanding the world? And that has to incorporate the personal and those things objectively out there in the world, which I think these paintings do. They're about those things in the world, but they're also about these responses that are intuitive, that allow a kind of free play to occur, keeping in mind, of course, that the success of a painting like that, when that free play comes into the mix, also means a very, very sophisticated and sensitive awareness of placement and space, and relationship to color and brush mark. But it also means that there has to be this awareness of how editing works. Editing is a really important part. Taking out what doesn't work is as important as what goes on. And I think you can see areas here that I would suggest on the painting on the right, some of that pinky red and some of those blue areas look to me as if they were areas of deliberate removal and editing of something else.
In here.
I think that's an interesting thing, because it also talks about the nature of painting as a decision-making, fluid, moment-by-moment experience, where when you can see the working out, as you might call it, on the canvas of ideas that the artist has had and sometimes rejected. And I think that, again, that decision-making process talks about cognition. How do we understand the world? What goes into this, from the outside world through the ears and eyes and the mouth and everything else, and combines with what we already have learned with new ways of trying to experience things in the world. And I think it's important to understand that relationship in these. We can jump to the next. So some of the stages, as we'll see, in interviews, Rae's talked about the need to set parameters and rules to engage in her paintings. And so they might be choices of color, they might be choices about things that are going to go into them, but she deliberately places these barriers to her own, to allow herself the struggle to find answers through the work. And we'll see that through these slides that she's actually adopted quite different approaches in many ways. I mean, it's recognizable as her work all the time, because it comes from the same sensibility, which again she has talked about in the past. That this is an acknowledgement that her own histories cannot be ignored, that they're always part and parcel of what makes up the human being. And in like the paintings, they are about the past as much as they're about the present. And her past is always present, because her interests in calligraphy, her interests in dragons, some things that crop up that I think you see replicated, and that gives a Fiona Rae painting its kind of motif base, which is why they're always recognizable. So in saying that, so we see these kind of impositions of rules to work by on these paintings. So if you jump, this one for instance is also to do scale. Okay, so now she starts going into these areas where she's incorporating these circles, which are very graphic. They have a very, very controlled nature. As you can see here, it's in opposition or in contrast to very gestural marks in the background, squiggles, etc. You can see that paintbrush. One of the things that I think is fascinating about her paintings is the mastery of techniques. I mean, she knows how to use brushes and anything else that she uses to paint with, and they really have I call a full toolbox. It shows that she's really learned to be a painter's painter, which of course as a painter is fascinating to me. But you know, she uses them in these ways, like I say, through the regulations that she self-imposes, to really try and create these things that are super inventive. And they always surprise me. Even looking at things I've seen, I don't know how many times I've seen some of these paintings, a fair number, and they always amaze me with like the virtuosity that goes into them, and the range that goes into this. And you know, that in itself, knowing what to place next to another thing to give these effects is really important. If you notice on this painting down the left-hand side, there's this much paler yellow. It's just slightly below the halfway thing that comes out. Not only does, that area, not only does it create a greater contrast with the circle that's right embedded into it, but it breaks up that yellow from top to bottom on the left. It breaks that up in a way that isn't, it doesn't drag your eye out, but it creates a compositional stability by including that. It's those kind of things that when I'm looking at paintings, I look for those kind of things. I think, leaving that, allowing that, placing it there is a really smart move to make sure that the painting isn't top heavy towards the right, where you can see there's the black gestural mark that goes up, which is a very strong visual element in there. It could very easily have just kind of overlapped to the right, but without giving it a kind of they're never too stable, you know, because if it's too stable, it can get dull. You know, like for me, seeing you know, paintings that are symmetrical, I lose interest in them almost immediately because it's predictable, and I think it's the unpredictable elements in her paintings that provide a lot of the fascination.
But it's an unpredictable intentionality, is what you're saying. Is that the mark making is very intentional with purpose?
Yeah. So there's within these things, I do think that there's an element where there must be some kind of awareness of the relationship between recognition and form. You still recognize certain elements, but you also know that other elements are these art elements that exist in this history of art, for instance, and stand in for, you know, emotional states, for instance. But when they're used in kind of ways, a question is how much do they exist in an emotional state outside of the artist? Now, for me, I don't care. And I don't care because I think that they talk about painting in really interesting ways. Do they talk about the artist's emotional state? That would be for the artist to answer. I don't know if, I suspect elements do, of course, but by the way that they're placed, the way that they're constructed, it means that the bigger discussion remains. And the bigger discussion is one about the history of painting, what painting is and can mean. And I think that retains, regardless of how emotional any kind of responses might be within the painting for the artist. Now, the reason why I think this is important is because it's a very it was a very typical approach from the YBAs at that time, was to base things in a loosely called conceptual framework for British painting and sculpture at the time, and I think it's obvious that this is true in these paintings. I think it's of a time and a place, but it's of a time and place that I'm from, and so I find that balance with this loose conceptualism is what grounds it into being the ability to start interacting on it on more levels, as it were. So look, I've got some notes, you see, and I'm just kind of scrolling.
That's okay. No, please do, please.
So the other thing is when we're talking about this history of painting, I think it's really interesting that it does have those things that are very much based in abstract expressionism, of course. But if the more one understands about the painting and the history of painting, there's more that one sees in this. Now, as an example, I would say that one can talk about how these work with the idea of surface in the same way as one talks about the work of Manet, not Monet, Manet. And you know, there's this kind of abstraction through in Manet that I think is really interesting. There's this foreground, background play, but which is always kind of deliberately superficial, if you like. It very much recognizes and reinforces the surface aspect of painting, and by doing that, instead of talking about a window, it talks about the literalness of painting. It's this material on this material. Again, this is, I think you could trace that back to Manet. I think you can also talk about cubist understanding of space and how the mind is as much to do with construction. It's all about the mind in construction, but as much as anything that we see visually, I think there's a whole bunch of these elements from art history that are very obviously, to me, being taken on board by the artist and then passed through the filter of her personal experiences in life and her knowledge of art history, and out they come in quite formally, I want to say quite formally constructed paintings, but with intuition and spontaneity being allowed into that as part of the process. Because I don't think that they are graphical. Some of them are, but mostly I don't think they're just purely graphical works with compositional stability, and I don't think the approach is quite as thought out in advance and specific, and that would leave no room for exploration, discovery, innovations, spontaneity, and all the things that I think these have in spades. Now, some of the parts of that is to understand that these arguments start becoming about what is the autonomy of the gesture, and the implications of some of these marks. Now, I'm going to just go into this really quick. Now, if the toolbox that one has, all these mark-making abilities, all these ways of painting, reflect on one side history, and on the other side possibility, hope, the idea that things are to do, that the future unfolds due to the actions of the artist as they go along. Now that refers to things like the importance of individual decision making, which is the core of cognition. It talks about action, following thought, and that these are the results of this process. The combination between meanings that are known to be generated culturally with meanings that are subjective and personalized in some way, hermetic. The combination of those things together in a constructed scaffolding of myriad sources from everywhere and different thoughts and changing thoughts. What these things kind of do, they create a worldview, if you like, in each painting, which has self-invented meanings. And I think it's important to understand that the self-invention of it all means that instead of relying for meaning from the outside world, it's generating that meaning. And in generating that meaning, it's kind of saying what counts in life, pushing against the parameters, pushing against the unknown is what we make it. And what we make it is the basis of existentialism.
Okay.
And so I find these on that level. I mean, a lot of the thoughts I have about painting came about through that process of thinking about art and possibilities and philosophy and all different areas. But it came about through thinking about various painters, Rae being one of them, later Albert Oehlen, certainly in earlier years Basquiat, Rauschenberg, a whole bunch of other artists. But they seem to me that they embody certain philosophical positions in not only the image, but the process. And I think this is really important because then it's not just this kind of weird idea that art is what anybody thinks it is. It isn't. And these things make that very clear that that isn't the case. We can jump. You don't want.
Sorry.
Sorry. Can you go back one?
This one or this one? This was first and then this one, but I can do this one now if you like.
Okay. Some of the things that start coming into that, which you mentioned earlier, is a lot more of this interaction with outside sources from graphics in particular, and these things starting to have in this very graphic shape, a sense of the 3D, for instance, which isn't a 3D, it's the fake 3D of 2 dimensions. And I think it's important to note the difference. So what it does again is it goes into space because it's 3D, but it doesn't because we recognize that in the same way as we do fonts, that it sits on the surface. It's a way of indicating something which doesn't exist. Whereas that kind of sprayed lighter color blue on the left has a spatial component to it. It has a sense through the overlapping juxtaposition of one thing over another and another thing behind it, that this exists in a space. It's still a shallow space, and it still has a unified background color, which again holds the whole thing together. So these elements aren't just kind of drifting around without any relationship. I mean, it's the background color that keeps it tight, even though these elements are kind of off by themselves. I really like the idea that in some way that each of the elements that are included are autonomous, existing somehow in their own worlds, and it's only the paintings bringing them together that allows for these new meanings to be formulated that relates them, because I think that talks about active cognition. And why I think that's important is we can't passively look at Fiona Rae paintings. That's not how they work. It requires you to look at these elements, to bring them together, start looking for those connections, so you are an active participant in the viewing of the work and generating meaning, because the meanings you generate might not always be hers or might not be hers at all, but you're still generating meaning. So in itself, it is part of a process of cognition for other people, as opposed to, when I look at it, well, it's my job to look a little harder, but some people might look at a landscape, just a landscape, move on. They've had a really passive experience with it.
I was going to just say, do you feel then that line of thinking as far as passivity versus being active in being an observer in any work of art, do you feel that the artist's intention is that we become active in looking at their work?
I think it depends on the artist. I think that regardless of what the artist says or does, we have to acknowledge that the viewer does something themselves too. And what that experience is can vary to the person looking. Is it inherent in the work that somebody will have an active? No, that's something that has to be put there by the artist.
Okay.
I don't think it, because there's a lot of art that say, as an example, there's a lot of art out there which makes a statement, and if the statement itself isn't complex or interesting enough, you go, the sky's blue. Sure, yeah, okay, you move on. You've had no constructive cognitive interaction with that work. Yeah, I can see it. Good, we're good now. And I don't think you can do that with this. And for reality, I don't think you can do it with any really great artist. I think you know, you can't, it's like saying, well, I had a really passive interaction by reading Plato. Well, you know, you can't really, you have to engage with ideas, and that's what it's for. You know, and that's why you want to read it, and that's why you read to the end. And I think it's a similar kind of thing with these. There's some things that I think are also interesting with this. They reflect, as I said before, that kind of hip hop and punk kind of aesthetics in some ways. But there also is this kind of, it brings it into the more modern, in the modern world, contemporary world, that they also have a collage-like look to them, you know, as if they're being played out through Photoshop. And again, I think that that does several things. I think it makes it interesting to have a discussion about what does painting mean in the age of, you know, the computer. A long discussion. But I also think it reflects some other things that maybe haven't been thought about very much, which is, as a child, she moved around a lot, as did I, you know, being an Air Force brat, ended up going from lots and lots of places. But I think what that does is you start seeing out of context elements, recognizing yourself as the loci for bringing together all these disparate elements and trying to make sense of them. And I think that these paintings do that. And perhaps reflect an experience of making sense of the world through engaging with all these very different parts of it constantly. And I do think that's important. I also think it's important that, I didn't realize this until I started doing some more research, is we're both subscribers to New Scientist magazine. And I think that's kind of interesting in as much as the reason I personally read New Scientist is it's always got this weird and wonderful information that it's kind of outside of my scope normally. And it tries to make sense of the world, and it tries to make sense of the world through a real hugely wide range of ideas and thoughts, but there are also ideas and thoughts that are outside of my normal world. And I think that, reading that is that way of bridging the gap a little bit. So I'm trying, because it informs, I think art needs to be informed by outside sources, and a New Scientist is a good reader for becoming aware of some of those ideas that you can plow back into the work. I mean, if anybody ever asks me what I think is the most important thing I've ever read in regards to my own work, it's always the Oxford Companion to the Mind, because so much of that was totally outside of art. And it's a hell of a read. It took me, I've read it 4 or 5 times now. I don't get my vast, areas of it, but it does inform me, thinking about art. So I think that too might be all part of this in terms of how to understand some of the things that she does. So jump, please. Okay, another one. In fact, it's getting to the point where it's nearly entirely graphic based. Even the clouds, which we saw in the previous one, were like this sprayed cloud, have now become cartoon-like with an outline. I think cartooning, I mean, this is kind of a separate discussion really, but I think cartooning is really interesting because it's a way to indicate a set of ideas to somebody very, very quickly. When we see Charlie Brown, we already know straight away, and the kid looks nothing like a real child. It's a circle with, but we recognize it through convention. And I think it's really interesting how cartoons, comic books, etc., and logos and everything else, they train us visually in these ways that are not non-natural in so many ways. But I heard somebody say like, oh, today's kids are visually illiterate. And I'd say absolutely quite the opposite. They might not talk about it in the same ways as somebody who spent years and years and years and years talking about it. But my God, they can recognize so many things, from images, G's or whatever, through, logos and everything else. They're quite capable visually. And I think some of this plays with that kind of variety of understanding of visual imagery and representation and meaning. Long-winded there. So yeah, another thing that I think is less so here, but maybe comes back a little later, and certainly was true in the earlier things, is that I think the paintings are very physically performative. There's this enactment of this movement, the elbow, the wrist, through these engagements with, say, abstract expressionism, etc. And I think that's important because it certainly is, besides the Pollock literal performance of painting, it's hard to think about painting, certain types of painting, as ever not being performative, as not being about, engaging with not only the act of painting and what the act of painting means, which is performative, but the physicality of it, etc. I don't know that it's, I mean, there's some people, if you make a small scale figurative painting, then yeah, maybe not performative in the same way. But I do think that the ramifications of an idea of performative action is important because it also backs up the existential argument, strongly, but it also changes the nature of understanding what goes on between the artist formulating the painting, making the painting, and the idea of audience, knowing that this is for somebody else, knowing that this is an act of communication in the end, that what I'm doing here by performing this is intended to be read at the other end, as opposed to the artist's idea that, I'm just this person, it's all about me and what I think, I don't think about the audience, I just have to make this. Well, why do you have to make it? And why do you not think about the audience? And if you don't think about your audience, then why do you show it? There's all these inherent acknowledgements of the lifespan of the painting through that idea of the performative.
And do you think too that there's also this sort of, like, I feel, and I remember feeling it in Studio System a lot, was this idea that as a viewer, we actually, I think, are drawn, no pun intended, but I think we are drawn to watch the work being created.
I think people really do. I love watching painters paint.
Yeah.
And I think people in general do. I think that the second best, of course, is going to a studio, because then it's like, oh, this is where things actually happen. I think those things are inherently interesting for anybody that's interested in painting. I would be careful about of making a deliberate distancing, if you like, between about what that looks like and in actuality, and how you might read it through the painting.
Okay.
One, even if it's performative and you don't see it, and even if you did see it, well, how it's done, there's a gap between that and reading it as performative because of, say, action like paint, gesture remarks, and how one intellectually reads that. I think that there's a gap there. There's a difference. Because otherwise you get fooled into this, well, I was like this, and then that must mean the painting means my emotional state. And I don't think it's quite as simple as that. Painting never means the emotional state of the artist, right? Because the viewer isn't in that state. They're reading it through a lens of understanding of this, and this.
Okay. One of the questions I used to ask the students that came through at the art museum was, and I'm realizing now it was a bit misguided and probably should have been worded differently, but which was, how do you think the artist was feeling when they created this work? Because I pivot and ask, then how does it make you feel? And is there any correlation between the two? And based on what you're saying, I'm not sure either one of those questions are valid anymore, but I still feel like people do respond very viscerally to some work more than others, and there's a reason for that. And I sometimes feel like when they're able to explain what that is, it helps them create a better relationship to the work that they're looking at, maybe.
So I'm going to read out a quick quote,
Okay.
which I think is really also interesting, because it kind of, well, we'll see how much it says. Okay, so quote.
Okay.
For me, my paintings are a reflection of what it's like to be alive. I don't experience the world as a complete whole with clearly delineated boundaries. There are terrible mismatches between myself and the outside world, end quote. And so what I think is this idea that you're filtering the world, not only through your own histories and your subjective experiences, but you're taking on board very deliberately the outside world as a separate entity, a separate experience, and you're filtering those experiences and those ideas and those visuals through this what you have, which is your own existence, your own being, and you filter that through, and this thing comes out the other end, which is obviously a mix of both. But I also like the idea that somehow there's a uncertainty there, that there isn't, it isn't making definitive statements about anything. That implies that meanings within the paintings are fluid. I would guess that if you asked about various aspects of each painting, that during the process of them being painted and afterwards, that they kind of take on a life of their own. And because one would reinterpret, one would see them in light of new developments, new ideas. And that even when something is being made, it can be made up of something that you thought was about this when you started, but by the time you finished it, it's become this, and then it reverts back again. I mean, it's never this singular kind of idea of it is this. And I think that that statement reflects it is never just this. She also talks a lot about paintings being endgames. And I think that's also interesting because you set up these hurdles to overcome, to work things out. And then after a while, of course, that means that you've kind of come to an understanding of them, which requires you then to change the ground rules because you do reach the cul-de-sac at some point. And I like the reinvention, even though you can see all of these are hers, there's definitely a reinvention of the parameters so that one is left with a new series of questions to follow. It's a bit like, internet, Wikipedia, going down the rabbit hole, and off you go. And again, for me, that's, I'm addicted to Wikipedia. I always have been since the first time I saw it. I thought, oh my God, pursuit in real time. Fantastic.
So we have about 15 minutes left and we have a lot more images. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to move to the black and white because then I have a little short clip, but I feel it's her and I feel like it'd be good to do that. And then we'll move on to the paintings over which you wanted to spend more time. I realized that we should have given you a 2-hour Tama talk on Fiona Rae, but let me just, actually, I want to do this one really quickly because of the panda. So this was part of that panda time. And let me see what I put here. She said, okay, so the overall ground color is threaded with motifs reminiscent of the hanging gardens found in classical Chinese landscape paintings. And the effect is one of lightness and delicacy. That is the Timothy Taylor Gallery writer about this piece, but she does, hold on, I thought I put in here where she says these new paintings were kicked off when I bought a string of Chinese embroidered pandas from the Pearl River Emporium in New York. The handmade stitching looks like colorful drawing on the black and white silk, and the wobbliness of their facture gives them ambiguous expressions and status so that they appear both ludicrous and ominous at the same time. So she does incorporate these little pandas in her work. And this work is just so different than that, which I find remarkable. So
recognizable as hers.
Yes. So this grayscale work, I'm going to look at the image for a minute because really it's quite significant, but then I'm going to run this video and then I'll go back to it. Let me know if you can hear it. You should be able to. Can you hear that? Okay, good.
I think I've always had an experimental approach to painting. I've always been interested to see what's possible and have in mind setting up a scenario for a group of paintings with the question, what if, in mind. So I think it was about a year ago I thought to myself, well, what if I made a group of paintings only using black and white and the tones of grey in between, grayscale paintings. And it was a very exciting and difficult challenge. I think that having a constraint in the sense that a limited number of things are going to take place on the canvas has meant that some quite subtle and exciting differences have been able to emerge. So in fact, by limiting myself to the kinds of marks I was going to make on the canvas and not using some of the things that perhaps I've used in the past, that I found myself in a very surprising place with these paintings. So for example, there's no paint accidents, and by that I mean there's nothing that's to do with paint doing its own thing without the intention of the human hand behind it. Every single mark on the painting has been expressed by me trying to communicate something. So there's no drips, there's no spatters, there's no pores, there's no veils or washes of paint. And equally, there's no kind of hard-edged signs or symbols or geometric shapes or kind of cartoon characters disrupting the flow of the marks. With this group of paintings, I wanted to see what would happen if I approached paint in a more kind of pure way, I suppose, whatever that means, and use the canvas as an arena for those kinds of marks. Oh, it was very exciting to set myself the task of making charcoal drawings. I had no idea whether it would be successful or not, or whether it was something that I could engage with as a contemporary artist. But what I realized I really like about it is how malleable it is, and how I could use the charcoal stick or my thumb or a razor and really kind of get to grips with moving this stuff around. Not quite as malleable as oil paint, but nevertheless surprisingly so, and use the paper itself as well as a presence in the drawing. I've always liked the idea of taking traditional materials and doing something very contemporary with them, and of course paint is a very traditional material. Essentially it's quite ancient stuff, and so is charcoal, and I really like the idea of seeing what that can mean in the present day, what you can do with it to make it seem alive and vital and relevant. And I think also because of the digitalization of our lives that there's something very appealing about the real and the surface and the texture and the actual experience of standing in front of a painting or a drawing and feeling it with your eyes and having a sense of it next to you with your body. There's kind of very human aspects of being alive in the world. I think that those traditional media can have something to do with relating to that.
So she summed it up pretty well. Yeah, I loved the idea about there were no accidents. You know, that everything was very, very intentional. And sometimes I think for people that don't particularly choose abstract work to look at for their go-to, you know, I think that knowing that there is an intentionality, I think, is key.
Well, remembering, of course, that the intentionality that she's talking about with this is specific to this group of the grey paintings, which is she removed all of the washes, all of the accidental, all the coincidence. You know, she had, yeah, that was the parameters she set herself on this set of paintings, which is interesting, because it's a really difficult one if you look at her past work.
And so this piece here that you selected, this figure 2A, it's almost as if she took those same works and then chose to add color to them.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to move down because we're running out of time. I'm going to move down to the pieces that you wanted to spend a little more time on.
So the ones that I respond to, I mean, we didn't see some of the ones where she uses black and white very strongly with the circles and dragging the paint and then allowing it to drip. There's a whole bunch of these different series you guys can see on her website, you know, and it's fascinating, whatever. But there's a few of the ones that were in that, not the really earlier stages, but quite early, 1990 for this one, that I think brings together for me the kind of everything that I want in a painting. It has all this activity going on. One needs to kind of run around it a lot and kind of find like instruments in a orchestra or something. They all have a different activity going on, and yet to me the whole seems to make sense. You know, maybe more like jazz than the orchestra. but I really like the fact that, yeah, that musical metaphors are often the best, or musical histories are often the best ways of understanding these. I think that there's, because we are going to run out of time now, and I do have to leave at 2 o'clock. So there's something I really want to end with, as it were, which, and I think this is a really great example, is as we increasingly live in a digital world, where our interactions are online through Zoom. Some of this will go back to meeting again at some point, but we are still living increasingly more through that digital world. And we see things like this whole thing with the non-fungible tokens. To me, they're GIFs or GIFs, depending on how you say it. And it's just, there's nothing there. And I don't care if it sounds reactionary. I think this is just emperor's new clothing. But if we're living this Photoshop world where so much of this is second, third, fourth, fifth kind of degrees of separation and and interaction with it, I think that one of the things I really, really like about her paintings are they are completely about an individual's hand. They are full of the realities of a human being doing what they do, and to see them in real life, of course. And even if you can't see them in real life, you can see that it's happening on this, whereas some of the other paintings just look like, yeah, you could have photoshopped it, you could have built. These are made by hand, and I really think it's important that the art is kind of the most human of activities. That music, it's about somebody doing something physically and us appreciating the remnants of what they did, and I do think that in some ways, the future needs to be more human, because technology is here to stay, and it's a good thing in general. But we need to make sure that we understand that there are aspects of humanity, music, culture, painting, all these things, that we need to keep a really tight grasp on our relationship to it. Because even now, I mean, I've heard enough people complaining that even too much music now is just this kind of auto-cued. And I think it's probably true, but I think that one of the Rae's greatest strengths is it is the humanity we can see in the paintings. I think we can't distance ourselves from that particularly without it being cloying and sentimental pap of like, oh look, baby crying. It really does speak to what it means to be a human being and interpret the world through this thing we call painting. And any questions?
I'm going to find that, and this is that last piece. Yeah, you had mentioned the rabbit hole in the notes that you had sent to me, yeah. That hyper-informational overload.
Yeah. I just, if you look on these, you can actually see like in the top right, that's kind of like a figure. And there's these elements of, even the drawing elements of this kind of really quick, jagged drawing style. I mean, that's so much of the hand, and it's all against this backdrop, if you like, of this very quite sophisticated construction of blocky forms. And in some ways, I think you can look at that and say, you can see where this leads from Hans Hofmann's experiments, and in such a great way. If you guys aren't familiar with Hans Hofmann, look him up. He did this push-pull idea of abstraction and solid forms, hard edges against gestural forms, and was a huge influence on artists in his day.
Do you see Sam's question about the emotional intention of her palette? Talk about palette for a little bit. I think it's
two things I think go on with that, and I think one is a deliberate disruption, because I think that they are often deliberately gauche. I think they are deliberately provocative, if you like, and unsettling. I do think that with anybody like Rae's work, who's obviously taking pains to understand what this role is and what things are, you often, artists can choose a color intuitively doesn't mean they don't understand how it works. You know, you can do this in retrospect. You think, oh, what it needs is the lilac, and you put the lilac down, and you can justify it in loads of terms later, and you can also make reference points to it later. But I do think a lot of those decisions are those artistic eye. I mean, you've got that kind of aqua green down there. Well, I mean, if you're going to have that aqua green down there, which has a solid line, you know, it's a hard edge form, that dripping lilac that's up to the, that's a counterbalance
to this.
The two colors perfect count, but they keep the intensity of the colors high. You know, as the yellow obviously does, and the orange in the bottom left. So they both bring in this kind of, and is the artist going to be aware of, say, cultural fashions and colors? Absolutely. Date 1991. Look at fashion. Look at like homeware. What colors were being used? Are some of these colors entering into this painting, or are they just? I mean, I would suggest if you remember back to 1991, there was a lot of stuff to do with surf fashion and stuff that would be using aqua colors and these kind of colors. Is she completely? Is that her source? I doubt. Maybe not. But that would have been culturally out there, and so it is emotional in some ways, but it's also, you know, there's a self-awareness to know that it can also be this, this, and this, and that even if you intuitively use something, doesn't mean you don't understand it in a wider context. Even if you could just say, well, I just liked it, sure. But you know, you can also look at your painting afterwards and say, yeah, I'm going to leave it there. And the reasons I'm going to leave it there is I like it, and it works, and and it kind of references this.
All right, I am going to go to our last slide, which does not include her work, but is just a thank you to you, Max, because it's always mind-blowing to just to keep up and like make my brain work around the words that you say. So it's quite a way to spend the afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I really do appreciate it. We do have a few times for some time for questions. So feel free to put them in the chat like Sam did, or unmute, turn your video on. I'll stop sharing the screen as soon as I'm done with this slide. I wanted to lift Max's article before I did. Our next Tama Talk is going to be on Friday, May 21st, and we are going to be discussing the very exciting upcoming public art project in Torrance called Ultra, that the Torrance Art Museum is spearheading, and so excited about it. And I'm just going to do a lot of teasing about it because I really would like people to tune in. I'll send an invite out about a week or so prior to the event. And you can also register now on the website. I'll switch out the graphic today. So as a reminder, the Torrance Art Museum does have a significant quantity of virtual work available on their website, www.torranceartmuseum.com. And let's see. Oh, I must not have put it on this one. Well, I will put it in Facebook because it's a very interesting article, and I think it talks about your work as well and the influence that she had on your work, which is kind of pretty cool. I am going to stop sharing in just a moment. Okay, if anybody wants to, oh, I know, okay, Janine, you're still on there. Everybody's still on there. Hi, Judy. I'm glad you could join us. I muted folks during the video piece, so if you want to unmute yourself, you certainly can.
I noticed that most of her paintings are in oil. Was that the medium that she chose through all of her continuing her career, or was it any other?
She's used acrylics as well.
Okay.
Some of the paintings are acrylics.
Okay.
All right, any other questions before we wrap up? We are at about 2:03. I'm actually for once on the same exact time zone that you are on. So
yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining. I will go ahead and thank you, Max. I will go ahead and send out the evite for the 21st discussion about Ultra, probably a week or so beforehand. I'm finding that a little too early. I like to give people time to put it on their schedule where we're not going to do them weekly. But we're hoping for a few other opportunities to have some Tama talks as the summer shows itself to us here in pretty Southern California. So, all right, everyone, thanks so much. We'll see you next time.